Hi, everyone. This is Kirsten Hagland, and welcome to the fourth and final session of our conference today, the Eating Disorder Hope Virtual Conference. We're so glad that you have joined us all day, and if you are just joining us, welcome. We're really excited. We have an incredible presentation for you today. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter. It's Travis Stewart. He is the Director of Marketing and Business Development at McCallum Place Eating Disorder Centers. He's worked in the field of eating disorders since 2003 in both clinical and marketing roles and at every level of care. He brings a unique blend of clinical expertise and communication skills to his role at McCallum Place. He's passionate about connecting people to resources and experiences that are transformative and healing. Travis graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1991 with a degree in advertising and immediately began working with the international ministry, the Navigators, mentoring students. After 8 years, his desire to better understand how people change and heal led to obtaining a Master of Arts in Counseling in 2001 and a Master of Arts in Theological Studies in 2003 from Covenant Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. Of course, that's where he now lives with his family, and he's joining us from there today. So welcome, Travis. It's so great to see you again, and of course to have you here as a part of our conference.
Yeah, great to be with you, and I love everything that Eating Disorder Hope does, so I'm always glad that I can be a part of it. And I love conversations with you because we have such a great time kind of, thinking about things and pondering things, and I've always enjoyed that, so I look forward to today.
Absolutely. And this is a really cool topic, and I can't wait to share it with all of you. It's something that I personally have always found extremely fascinating, and we're hoping that this can be fascinating and educational for you guys as well. We're talking today about body views, which is different than body image per se, which we're going to talk about a little bit. But we really want, Travis and I really want this presentation to be not only educational and informative as we look at the history and the evolution of body views all the way from ancient Greek and Roman philosophy through to the present and maybe what the future of body views look like. But we also really want this to be informative in how you, if you're, especially if a treatment professional, how you help your clients. Right, Travis?
Yeah, that's great. And I got interested in this when I was first a therapist working with clients, and the particular treatment center that I was at the time had female staff do body image work. So I was kind of like, well, what's my role in helping women with body image? And so I just started doing more reading and thinking, and then my mix of my theological studies had me thinking about it from kind of a spiritual, cultural perspective. So for me, this came out of just an interest and desire to learn. So I hope that I can pass on some of that today. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just dive right in and start out with what is a body view?
Okay. And here's where we're going to, hopefully the technology will participate, and let's see if I can get the screen to change. Did I lose you?
Oh, we're still on the desktop. There we go. Perfect.
Ah, there we go. All right, it's working. So let's first just describe body image, right? Body image is shaped by a complex patchwork of historic, cultural, and personal influences. And so, yeah, body image can be, impacted by how your family talked about body, how your culture talks about body, experiences like a teasing or trauma or affirmation about your body. So, just as a baseline, body image is kind of what we're used to talking about. These things also affect our body view. And this is, a different, it's more about how we think and sometimes don't think. We don't realize we're thinking. It may be how our culture thinks about bodies. What are they? What makes them up? What happens to them after death? How should we treat them? So body views address some of these questions, and there's lots more that we could put on here, but how do I treat my body? What is acceptable body transformation? In other words, shaving, plastic surgery, tattoos. In some cultures, they extend the necks, or they bind the feet, those types of things. How do we think about the body kind of philosophically? Is it good? Is it evil? Is it neutral? What's my responsibility towards my body? What does it mean to take care of it? Why do I take care of it? What's my responsibility toward the body of others? How do I interpret appetites and desires. Where do they come from? How's it related to my body, my soul, my mind, all those types of things. And then what's the relationship between mind and body? Is there a distinction? And all of these questions, I mean, if you just start to, type in mind and body and you start to explore that, you'll get lost for hours in historic debates and questions and current neuroscience and all those things. But body views kind of encapsulate all of those things. And we usually don't talk about it. We don't bring it up in our sessions. We're not talking about outside of maybe we talk about media in the eating disorder world. We'll often address that. That's only one part of a body view. And so I just kind of want us to dive a little bit more into kind of exploring that idea.
Yeah. And it kind of also has to do with worldview, right? Your body view comes from someone's underlying worldview. And I don't think also that I had ever talked about what my worldview or where my values came from in a therapy session before. I was doing that kind of in my own work because I'd heard that word before, but it doesn't often come up in therapy sessions, and maybe it should.
Yeah. And I think it's a tricky one because we as therapists don't want to, push our worldview onto somebody. We want to be respectful and careful, but I think it's also okay to be curious. I think we need to be curious and help the other person be curious about their worldview. So let's look at the, so worldview would be questions like, how do I make sense of suffering? What is the source of human rights? What defines right and wrong? Those are worldview questions. So body views would sort of be a subset of that. So, but yeah, we don't generally talk about that. So I think if we can kind of overcome the fear of offending someone and be genuinely curious enough to ask questions about those, I think we'll learn a lot. And I think it'll inform our therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So let's dive into the history of where we are now. What are American body views and how did we get here? I love that, by the way. I've been running away with the leg.
I know. Isn't that a great picture? I don't know where I found that. I'm just like, I don't know what this means. It's such an intriguing photo.
It's naturally like hilarious and doesn't make sense. So it seems pretty like American to me.
Right. But it also like we're going to end up with part of the American worldview is that the body is an object. So this is a great kind of image, reflecting that. So, but okay, so some disclaimers. Number one, we're going to take a really high level view, partially for time, partially because I'm still learning, right? So I want to give a real high level view. We're also going to skip some really important things. I may mention them as we go on, but there won't necessarily be slides just for sake of time and trying to identify things. We're also talking about American body views. I can't cover what is the history of body views in the, African culture, because I don't know it, for one thing, but also because most of our listeners and watchers, viewers today are dealing with American clients. So we're going to focus in narrowly, but I don't want to make any assumption that that's all there is. So we're going to look at kind of a history of Western culture, Western civilization, and American, how we ended up where we are today. So that's where we'll start. And I hope that we can continue to learn as our culture becomes more diverse, how other things influence us. So let's start with the ancient Greeks. This is actually an interesting painting that will apply to the next slide of what we talk about. In the middle there, you see the two gentlemen under the arch, and you see the one in the red. That is Plato, and then the one in the blue is Socrates. And we'll talk more about the poses that they're in. You have the pointing up and the pointing out. But we have to, whenever we think about American Western civilization, we have to start with Greek culture because it's had such a profound impact on us, how we think, how we, the alphabet we use, all of those types of things are influenced by this. So when we think about the Greeks, we're going to just highlight a couple things, and we're going to focus mainly on Plato. All right. So in that photo, or in that painting, rather, not a photo, we saw Plato pointing up, and Socrates was kind of pointing out, and that is an illustration of Plato's view, which pitted kind of a spiritual, or in some ways it'd be mental. When he said spiritual, it wasn't exactly what we mean by spiritual. It was more about the world of thought and ideas against a lower and material physical existence. So in other words, in Plato's worldview, the world of ideas, philosophy, all of that was what you should attain to. That was good, while the physical world was not necessarily evil in his view, but it was certainly not nearly as important. It wasn't as real. It was more of a shadow of the real, right? And so he began this idea that spirituality, although he defined it differently, is more important than physical existence. And you can see how quickly that could be translated into how we're dealing with the body, right? That the body could be secondary, not as important. I don't have to pay as much attention to it, or I only pay attention to it as it serves the higher need, right?
Yeah.
G.E. Ladd, who's a scholar, he writes that Platonism, this view of Plato, is a dualism of two worlds. One the visible world, and the other invisible spiritual world. And as I mentioned, has far-reaching implications. It still influences us today in how we think about spirituality and physical things and things like that, although we've had a lot of other influences, which we'll talk about, that have come to play. So let me pause. Any questions or thoughts on that?
Well, you know what I'm thinking of as well is that, yeah, obviously Plato, we think of Plato and Socrates, and Aristotle, especially Aristotle, who was considered the father of scientific thought and scientific inquiry, obviously,
yeah.
far, far prior to the scientific revolution. But where he focused very much on the physical and very much on the material. So
actually, it might be Aristotle in the painting. I think I flipped the names there.
Yeah, but it's interesting, and then you kind of see this similar kind of Platonic thought embodied in Stoicism, the philosophy of Stoicism in Greek culture, which also was kind of the suppressing of, and now a real Stoic, because it's interesting, you're seeing a resurgence in Stoic philosophy today, and people claiming, well, I don't have a religious persuasion, but I am a Stoic. They would say it's not suppressing of emotions, but it's rising above emotions, which would be considered physical, right? Or responses to very base things like hunger or sexual desire or, fatigue or hunger, things like this, and rising above that to be more in this higher spiritual plane of ideas. So it's something that continues to come back, this idea that the body and its appetites are more base, and that the ideas and the level of the mental and that pursuit is higher. So yeah, it's fascinating.
And if you've worked at all with somebody dealing with anorexia, you can see how quickly that can apply to their worldview, their thoughts, their behaviors. Absolutely. So let's look at the next slide real quick. It's just a quote by Plato that demonstrates his thinking. He says, "Indeed, the soul reasons best when none of the senses trouble it, neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor pleasure, but when it is most by itself, taking leave of the body, and as far as possible, having no contact or association with it in its search for reality." I mean, just as I read that, kind of memories of conversations with clients who are dealing with anorexia come to mind. In that's driving, and that's why this topic's important, is we need to understand that at some level the culture has been pushing this all the way back from ancient Greece. So all right, so you ready to move forward in time?
Yes
Let's go to early Christianity. So we're talking 2,000 years ago. This is a painting in which doubting Thomas is putting his finger in the side of Christ. And for him, Thomas, he gets a bad rap, right? But he really wanted to know. He said, if this is real, I want to know that he was really physically resurrected. I want to touch him. And that was actually a core piece. And this is where I know the most because of my studies. I'm going to try to just give a brief summary of it. But the physical body in the Hebrew faith and in early Christianity share a lot in common. And there was a high importance on that. So let's look at the next slide. So the Hebrew and early Christian idea is that the body is good, right? And that it's created by God and it's made to reflect the image of God, and that the human body should be cared for and respected. And that has all sorts of implications into behavior and morality and things like that. So a couple of things that the early Christian belief brought in that was maybe a little different than the Hebrew faith, and certainly different from the surrounding Greek and Roman worldviews at the time, is that when God became man, what theologians call the incarnation of Christ, it affirmed the goodness of the material world. So if God is willing to step into the world and take on human flesh, then that must mean he believes it's good, or that there's goodness to it, right? And we see that continued. The early Christians would have believed that there is great value in the human body because they told stories about Jesus healing, restoring sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, giving lame people the ability to walk. And in fact, there's one story where John the Baptist, he's in prison and he is wondering if Jesus is the Messiah that he was proclaiming was to come. And so he sends his disciples to Jesus and says, "Are you the one?" And Jesus doesn't give an answer like, "Well, don't you see all the conversions I'm doing, or all of the prayer retreats I'm having?" What he said was, "Don't you see I'm healing the blind and the lame?" He affirmed the goodness of the body by saying it is important enough for us to heal it and restore it. And so that's one of the basis of the Christian faith that brought in from early Christianity. Now that gets lost later, as we'll see, a lot of it in the church. So yeah. Let me pause there for you.
Yeah, no. And I think it's also really important to highlight this kind of the early Christian philosophy and how different it was than from what emerged. And we're going to get into that more medieval Christian theology, which then started bringing back some of that Platonic thought as well. And it kind of got changed. But I also, I think it's important here to mention the Hebrew concept as well, is when we say that, we live in a culture now in Western society where so much of our ideas have, we call it a Judeo-Christian view.
Right.
This came from Hebrew culture as well. And so Jews have a very similar view of the body and view of life, of just how important human life is. And that it was a concept that was very, very much intertwined. So, and one that is we'll get to this later.
Yeah.
I'll save that for later.
Well, and one of the things that the Hebrews brought in was, there's lots of debates about, like, are we a soul and a spirit and a body, or are we just a body, and all of those types of things, which we'll touch on. But the Hebrew concept that then the early Christians adopted as well was, we are a whole person. We don't need to split it all up and figure out, are we soul and spirit and body, but rather we need to affirm a person as a whole person. And that is a really important piece that influences a lot of the thinking. So let me go to the next slide. Go ahead.
One more thing, Travis, that I just thought about, which was essential in Jewish, Hebrew and Jewish culture, and then in early Christianity as well. Whereas, especially in Roman culture at that time, which was a warlike society, and it was very hierarchical and very structured. Also, the worth of the body and the worth of other people's body was very much based on status and hierarchy within that society. And even in Hebrew culture, when you read in the Old Testament, the way that they even treated foreigners, who today we would call immigrants, or or whomever, they still said treat the foreigner, treat the person outside of, at that time, the Jewish faith, as a human being as well. And so bodies, wherever they were on the hierarchical structure of society in early Jewish as well as early Christian culture, was very much equal, that all bodies are sacred in a sense. And it didn't matter where you were in the hierarchy, which was absolutely revolutionary in Roman culture at the time, where your body only mattered if you were high up in the status, otherwise you were a slave or lower. So,
well, and that's one of the reasons that Christianity grew early on, was that when illness struck the Roman culture, the Romans didn't want to go touch the sick. And the early Christians, because of this value of the body, were willing to go in and be nurse and doctor the sick back to health. And when people experienced that care, that was a part of the growth of the church. Okay, we got to keep moving because we got a lot to cover. So, all right. So we have, the early Christian church, and then obviously we're skipping, hundreds of years here, right? But I want to kind of hit some of the high marks and critical things along the way. So the church grew. Eventually, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, right? And so there's lots of different things going on at that time. And one of the things the church started to feel is that because it became officially accepted throughout the kingdom, it started to feel like it lost its value. And so they felt like they were being absorbed into the culture and not recognized for the value that it had to offer. And so there became a movement to withdraw from the culture, right? And so this is when you see the growth of monasteries and medieval desert fathers who withdrew and went and contemplated and meditated out in the desert. It was all part of this desire to not be, corrupted by the culture. And out of that grows this ascetic movement. And so this is a painting of Saint Bartholomew. We'll have a quote on here. And I'm just going to barely touch on this. We do know that out of the same movement was some of the early studies of eating disorders. We saw, restricting and fasting taken to extremes, in which it wasn't anorexia exactly like how we see it today, but it was certainly, restriction for the sake of personal goals. So let's just look at a couple things. So you mentioned earlier that the church was influenced by the Gnostic philosophy, I think, and also the Platonic philosophy. So the Gnostics took it a step further. Plato said the spiritual world is better than the physical world. The Gnostics went a step further and said, no, the physical world is evil and bad, and we need to reject it at all costs, and we need to move away from that. And you move away from that, and you grow through secret knowledge. Gnostic kind of comes from that word, secret knowledge. And so the church starts to get influenced by this. And so they're taking that early Christian thought, but then they're mixing it with Platonic thought and Gnostic thought. Some of the early letters from the Apostle Paul were written towards addressing this Gnosticism, right, that he saw starting to have a negative influence. One of the ways it did that was, here's a quote by St. Bartholomew, people in the culture began to feel like if the body's evil, I need to control it. And he said, we must inflict our body with all kinds of adversity if we want to deliver it to the perfect purity of the soul. That's only one quote of many, many quotes that we could find out there about the need to control the body so that my spirit can grow. And already we've lost that idea that the early Christians had, that the body was good. And so there was self-flagellation, vows of poverty, fasting, abstinence, sleep deprivation, all kinds of things. Now, the tricky part in all this is that St. Bartholomew and others also did incredibly wonderful things, right? And so we can't just kind of say that was all bad. We have to be discerning when we look back at history and kind of go, what were the benefits of that? But also, was there damaging results from some of those things? We have to do that at every level. There were certainly things that early Christians did that were not helpful as well. So that's kind of where we have in the mid-age, the medieval period, on kind of how they were thinking about the body. And you can see how that translates into kind of how we practice faith, religion today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. We're going to keep moving. So we're going to look at the Puritans. Now, the Puritans get a bad deal, I think. They at times they certainly were overly rigid, and there were certainly damaging things done by the Puritans. But I was surprised. So I've kind of over the years been trying to find books on body image and history, and they're hard to find. Sometimes I'll be in a used bookstore and I'll find this random book. And I don't even remember how I found this book, but it's called Dissenting Bodies by Martha Finch. And what it turns out, she's a professor at Missouri State University, where my daughter goes. So I'm going to try to get a coffee with her sometime or something. The entire book is on how the Puritans viewed the body. And so I picked it up and I started reading it, and I was pleasantly surprised by some of the things that the Puritans believed about the body. Let me slip to the next slide. They basically believe, they came out of a tradition that held to John Calvin's views, and basically believed that spiritual maturity was manifested through the body, physical expression, dress, speech, eating, all of life. So in other words, if you're growing and if you're faithful as a Christian, then that will be visible through how you live life, right? That was one of the things that they really held to high regard. They had this view of the body that it was both a temple, in other words, it's good, but it's also broken. So it can experience illness and desires that are not helpful and sin. So they had this dual view of the body, not that there was good and evil battling in the body, but rather that at core the body was good, but it's broken, and can have broken expression in the way that you live life. So they're moving away from the dualism of spiritual and physical life as separate that Plato and the ascetics had. And they're saying, no, all of life is spiritual and all of spirituality is life, right? And how you live out of the body is expressed in that. Mm-hmm. The thing that surprised me the most, go ahead.
Oh, no, and I was just going to say, and why I think this is so important to identify too, is when you look at, since we're talking about the history of American body views and how, right. America as a Western culture, where we stand now. I mean, the Puritans founded America. So, it's and those views shaped so much of our early, even just the way that society was constructed, which is why it's so important to figure out where they stood on some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. There were other views going on, but this was a dominant view that shaped much of our culture. In fact, in her book, she's looking specifically at the Plymouth community. I mean, so the people who literally founded the country held these views. What surprised me the most, because we tend to think of the Puritans as very severe. We tend to think of them as very rigid, and they're wearing the black dresses, and the black collars and all that. What's interesting is at the time, that was actually very fashionable. That was not necessarily about being modest and hiding everything. That was actually high fashion, is one of the things. But what's also interesting is they had an emphasis on moderation in all things. So in eating and drinking and all of these things, there was a goal to have moderation, which is a phrase that a lot of clinicians in the eating disorder world talk about today. Intuitive eating in a lot of ways is moderation in all things. So it's interesting to see how some of these different views, can have a history in our culture. So, Absolutely. All right, we're going to keep moving to the Victorian era. When I think of the Victorian era, I think, Christmas, Charles Dickens, and I think of TV shows and movies, and I always think of people with really bad teeth for some reason. I think of that era.
Brits are gonna hate you.
Yeah. So I didn't say British, American Victorians too, but I think of that, culture. And what's true, what those movies get right is that there was a lot of health concerns at the time because of how our poor health system, poor sanitation, poor medical care, all those types of things.
And people moving increasingly to cities, increased urbanization because of the Industrial Revolution caused all these just massive, all the diseases that come from crowded cities and poor sanitation. Yeah.
Yeah, you can handle the sanitation issues if you're on a farm, right? And it's just your family you're dealing with, but you put all these people together so all of this is exploding around the time of the Industrial Revolution and all these things, cities growing and stuff. This drawing here is, it's great because out of the same time came the growth of our fitness movement. Out of the Victorian era came an emphasis on health, the founding of the YMCA, the early days of professional sports. You'll love the picture I have here. These are some early women doing exercises.
I'm sure they're really working out those biceps too.
I know, I love the picture. It's so funny because it's so what we're doing now. And so it's so different than what we do, So there was a context of disease, epidemics, poor healthcare that was ravishing the world, particularly American and British culture, the rudimentary healthcare. And so they became obsessed with health. They thought about health all the time, of how to get healthier. And out of that grew, the founding of the YMCA, professional sports in America, baseball, kind of the early days of football, all of that sort of grew out of that need to get healthy. And one of the ways they began to believe about getting healthy was through physical exercise. And then you see how that develops into kind of Teddy Roosevelt and the growth of the masculine man who's active and out in the wilderness, and all of those things grew out of the same culture. So it influences our views of femininity, masculinity, health, fitness, all of those things. Those didn't start in the 80s. It started back in the Victorian era, which we then saw develop. So that one was really interesting. There's also a book specifically on that you can find. So, all right, let's go to the next one. So this is a phrase that gets tossed around, Christo-Platonism, right? So the painting here shows angels. And so this is an Americanized version of the church. And it basically takes the idea that sort of when we die, we become angels. That's what the painting looks at. And so let me just show you some examples of this. Maria Shriver, she wrote a book, I don't know, I guess probably 10, 15 years ago now, called What's Heaven? And I think it was written for her kids. And she was trying to answer the question of what is heaven? Because I think their grandmother had died, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is just a quote out of the book. It's a children's book. She says, "Heaven is a beautiful place where you can sit on soft clouds and talk. When your life is finished here on earth, God sends angels down to take you to heaven." So what's interesting about this is it captures so much of what Americans, for much of the 20th century, believed about heaven and death in your body, that when you die, you lose your body, you become a spirit, bodiless creature that floats around on clouds. That essentially says the body's not that important, right? And if you're really spiritual, you're focusing on spiritual things, heavenly things. So you're thinking and praying about God all the time, and it's okay to sort of ignore the body. In fact, it's spiritual to not pay attention to the body. So again, it moves far, far from what the early church said about the body, that the body will be resurrected. And it kind of brings in that Platonic view again. And it's very influential in our media and our movies. And I can remember many movies as a kid that sort of painted this picture. So again, the church got mixed with Greek culture and influenced then how we think about the body. There's a really interesting book, if you can find it. It's called Born Again Bodies, which traces the history of the diet culture through the church. Through the 20th century, and just kind of fascinating if you're interested in those things. So that's kind of Christo-Platonism. All right. So one scholar, just another slide on this. Greek-speaking Christians influenced by Plato saw our cosmos as broken, and the idea was not to make it right, but to escape it. So that's where you have a lot of Christian spiritual, and not just Christian, other spiritualities, faith traditions. Let's get away from the bad world. The body's unnecessary, something we leave behind. So that view has been very influential. And I know, as I worked with clients, that idea that if I'm really mature, especially clients who are have a strong religious faith, they have grasped onto that view that says, if I'm really spiritual, I'm going to deny my body, and I will deny my hunger, I will deny my needs, I will just deny my thirst. It can be a very damaging view. And what's interesting is it's not really aligned with their historic faith, but rather the mixture.
Yeah. And one thing, and we actually didn't talk about this before, but I just thought about it and I want to mention it briefly, is I think too, and I think you saw this throughout the 20th century with the rise of the evangelical movement as well, is that with this kind of view of as the body being bad and appetites associated with it, also just this intense, a very, very strict and rigid sexual moral ethic
yes,
as well, and viewing sex as bad, which then also, increased a lot of shame and guilt associated with sex. And of course, even Christians, whatever your view is or whatever your religious tradition is, the Christian view of sex being holy inside marriage, unholy outside of marriage. Obviously, that's not something that a lot of people who are not Christians believe, but so the normal Christian view would have been sex inside of marriage is still a good thing, but just the intense pressure of messaging on sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad, created just a whole lot of shame associated with sexuality and therefore the body, and therefore by extension, women's bodies. as
Yes.
sexual objects. And I think that that has led to a lot of what we're going to transition now into, to the consumer perfectionism here. But I think that's just the sexual element of that, especially related to maybe some ways that Christianity went wrong in the 20th century in the United States, is an important thing to talk about, the foundation of where we are now with body views.
Yeah. And I mean, as our listeners can tell, I mean, we could spend an hour on just each slide probably, because there's so much that goes into it. But it really is influential, right? How many clients have shown up in our office with incredible amounts of shame because of just what you're describing? And then that results in, you know, the eating disorder behaviors as a way to cope with that shame. So all of this is out there. So, all right, let's keep going. So let's talk just briefly about evolution and materialism. So Charles Darwin, and then some of the more recent proponents of materialism, Richard Dawkins, right? So just we'll highlight a couple things. So some of the results of this, human beings are the result of our evolutionary adaptations, which function to help our species survive. In other words, humans evolved out of adaptation rather than were created, which changes a different view of the body. So as our culture began to wrestle with those beliefs, you know, then we began to become more split, more polarized around what those things are. And it also shapes, if your body's not created by good or by God for good, then what is it? And then so materialism and evolution has had to wrestle with that question. You know, what is the value of the body in the context of this new worldview that we're holding? You know, that the materialist worldview holds that the person ceases to exist upon death. So all we have is the here and now, that I don't have a soul. Richard Dawkins would say, we don't have souls. It's just the combination of neurons in our brain. There is no spirituality. And that when we die, and that's the end of it. And so that has implications then, right? And so you can see how if a Christian's coming into your audience, they're going to bring some things with them that influence their view of the body, just as if an atheist comes into your office, they're going to bring some things that may be influencing their view of the body, whether they're talking about it or even aware of it or not. These things are going to be in, you know, the culture of their own personal beliefs. And so, and then obviously another evolutionary belief, which can be taken many ways, but the whole idea of survival of the fittest, right? So Darwin didn't mean fit in the same way that we mean fit, right? But that idea becomes influential as we move forward. So barely touching on Darwin and materialism, but I just wanted to mention that because over time, this is more and more of an influential view in our world that is impacting people's lives. And so I think it's important to explore it. Okay, next slide. Jane Fonda. This view I call consumer perfectionism, right? And so this things get a lot fuzzier as we get a more diverse culture and more beliefs and influences coming in. And so, but what holds us together? Well, one thing that held us together after World War II was this period of growth, economic growth. Then when that happens, we don't have to worry so much about meeting our daily needs, right? We're not so worried about where's the food going to come from today as we grow economically. We can shift more towards what kind of food do I want today? And not just, do I have a nice house or a roof over my head, but what kind of roof do I want over my head? And so we began to see this incredible growth, which shifts our attention towards material comfort and more time to notice ourselves. It's interesting. I think the handheld mirror, I can't remember the exact dates, but it was early 1900s. So by the 1950s, everybody had mirrors in their homes. So now there's more opportunity to be self-critical and notice how you look. So this is all growing through the 20th century, right? More attention to how I look, more attention to how I feel, more time to spend in leisure activities or recreational activities. And then so by the 80s, we have this explosion of fitness videos. And Jane Fonda was kind of the first and most influential. And I mean, they didn't think it was going to sell when they first did her video, and it exploded, right? And it spawned a whole new industry of fitness, media personalities who are telling us how to tone our tummies and how to get fit and what we need to do and the growth of all those types of things. Which then bring us into today, and the continuing growth. We see so many images of ourselves. We see so many implications of how I look. And so this consumer, I'm going to consume, and then I'm going to have to present a perfect life, this perfectionism. I need to present it to myself, and I need to present it to others, is one of the overarching and most powerful themes in the development of eating disorders, I think, in the last 40 years. We've seen it. I mean, it's no surprise that this grew in the 80s, and we've seen more and more eating disorders since then. So that's kind of where we are heading into today. So let's go to the next slide and look. Just briefly, we're going to touch on Middle Eastern faiths. We're going to come back to that consumer perfectionism in a sense. I'll pull all these together. But we are more and more influenced by Middle Eastern and Eastern faiths in our culture. More and more people are seeking these out because they don't feel like they connect with kind of the traditional Christian or Judaic views. And so they're seeking out these. Plus, we have more people in our culture who have this background. And so I just want to touch real quickly on some of the views that these faiths hold and how that's beginning to shape us. So Buddhism. This is a summary of Buddhism. The body and the mind, or spirit, are not two entirely separate entities. The body is not a vessel that is guided or inhabited by the mind or spirit. Rather, the body and mind combine and interact in a complex way to constitute an individual. What's interesting is you can kind of see some similarities to the early Hebrew belief that it's not separate, but it's a whole person and it's complex. And we interact. We maybe have a spiritual part and we have a physical part, but they're interacting and integrated. Now, in Buddhist religion, there is debate about the body. Some people see the body as an obstacle, and can kind of aligns with that Gnostic view that it gets in the way of spiritual growth. And others say, no, it's a path, and we can use the body to gain more insight and to grow spiritually. So there is debate within the Buddhist views around that. So, and then let's just touch briefly on Islam. This one, interestingly enough, has some similarities to the Hebrew view in the sense that the body is good. It's a gift from God. And that our ownership of the body is described as a kind of stewardship. That's a fancy word for taking care of. So somebody who has been gifted something. So if I said, hey, Kirsten, I'm going to leave my phone with you. Will you take care of it? You are then being the steward of my phone, right? So the Islamic view is God has given us a body to take care of it. An incredibly high view of the dignity of the human body. And we see that as it plays out, for example, even in death. So what do they do with the body after death? There are lots of guidelines and rules about how to treat a body after death. So there's a very high view of the body in the faith of Islam. So more and more people in your offices are going to be bringing these views into with them. And I think it's important to be asking, well, tell me how you think about the body. How does that relate to your faith? How does that relate to your spiritual life?
Yeah, and also I just want to mention too, in Hindu culture as well, there's a very strong view of the body as it relates to then as well reincarnation. As well, which is a very, and obviously there's billions of Hindus in the world. And this is a view that I've come into contact with many of my friends and things. So they have a very interesting view of the body as well. And I've known people of all these faiths who have struggled with eating disorders, and the culture and background from which they come has a lot to do with how they view their body and how it uniquely affects their struggle. So these questions about where does your body view come from are really, really important.
Well, and imagine also, let's take just as a case study, a girl or a boy who's grown up in a Western American culture, and they're holding more to the Western view of the body possibly, but their parents might be holding to, the traditional Islam view. Think about the tension that brings as the father sees maybe his daughter mistreating her body. Think about all of the family dynamics that get stirred up in that. And that's going to be true in all these different perspectives and faiths. So, okay. All right. So what's our cultural legacy? I had to find a picture of somebody taking a selfie of themselves, in the gym, right? Because now we don't just work out for ourselves. We work out so that we can share it on social media, and for everybody to see the progress that we're making, or to motivate ourselves to look better the next time, or to go to the gym. And it's like, oh, I put the selfies up, I need to keep going, things like that. But what I want to identify is there's a few of the views that we've held on to from all of these different views we've talked about, and there's a few that we've lost. So our clients, and many in our culture, are going to hold on to some of the, I just picked a few. The survival of the fittest, which came out of the evolution and materialism view. We can see this in our culture, right? And in our clients, they come in with this idea that those who have the best bodies, lose the weight, have the most self-control around diet and exercise are going to be valued. They're going to survive. They're going to be the fittest and the strongest, right? And strongest depending on their definition of strong, things like that. So that's one view that I think influences our clients. My body is unnecessary or evil. I've had conversations with clients about this very thing. They feel like it's evil, or it doesn't deserve to be cared for. That can often be combined with, a history of trauma, things like that. Obviously, trauma can make you have a sense that your body is evil or unnecessary, unwanted. I want to get rid of it. I want to disappear. That aligns with some of the medieval and Platonic views. My body defines me, which is that consumer perfectionistic view, but also materialism. If there's not a soul part to you, then all you have is the body. So that can have a pretty big impact on someone unless they find some other ways to develop a sense of purpose and meaning, right? If they hold to the material view and don't find a sense of purpose and meaning, then why live is the conclusion that they can come to, right? And then we, just like the Victorians, we're obsessed with health. It just looks different. It turns into the latest diet or the latest fad, or detox or things like that. So I think those are some of the views that we've held on to that still influence our clients today. So I'm going to go to the next slide, unless you had anything to add on that.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So what are some of the views that I think we've lost in our culture? One is that the body is good. I think certainly I see that when I work with Christian clients. They've lost that. They don't understand that that was a part of the early Christian teaching. And so they've embraced the body as evil. But also just in our culture as a whole, that, we as a culture believe your body is good if it marks these check boxes. If it's the right weight, the right size. There's very little belief that the body is good simply because it exists, because it offers you the opportunity to interact with the world, to interact with others. There's all kinds of value to the body that we've lost. We've also lost the view that I am more than my body. So Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, they all say in one way or another that the body is good and I'm more than my body. Like, that it doesn't, it is part of me, but it doesn't define me. It is essential to me, but it's not all that I am. So I think we've lost that view. And we've lost that idea of moderation in all things. So that our culture really, really struggles with that. I would imagine, as I know you've been overseas recently, to get kind of a different view on American culture and how much we struggle with moderation. I'm sure you could speak to that a lot. And so we've lost some of the early Puritan view about moderation. We do well to bring some of that back. So those are some of the things that I take away from that, how we're being influenced today by all these different views.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so let's move to you have a German philosopher whose views on how we can create a healthier body view, taking all this into context. Thomas
Right.
Fuchs, if you want to share with us
Yeah.
his views, which are cool.
Yeah. So
bringing together of all of this.
So out of all of these views, there's things that are positive, probably, and negative that you can pull into. And some create shame and some create freedom. And so I want to take I like to lay his philosophy kind of on top of it all to think about how can we help our clients in these things. And so we're going to talk about the lived body experience. So Thomas Fuchs is a professor, a psychology professor, and studies phenomenology at the University of Heidelberg. And he defines two ways of viewing the body. One is the lived body and one is the corporal body. We'll define both here. So let's start with the lived body. The lived body is the experience we have of the body when I act through my body, perceive, and exist through it without explicitly reflecting on it. It is my relation to the world as mediated and lived by the body. Now that's, some people probably pick that up and others are kind of like, what's he saying? In other words, when I am walking my dog and I'm out walking and I'm not thinking about my body, I'm just living it. I'm noticing the smells of winter coming. I'm noticing the chill in the air. That's a lived body experience. That, he says, that bodily experience, when we can have the lived body experience, decreases shame, guilt, self-awareness, awareness of the size and shape of my body. We want to be moving clients towards what he calls the lived body experience, which is different than loving my body. This is a little bit more about being self-forgetful. Not forgetful in the sense that I'm going to forget to care for my body, but forgetful in the sense of I'm not thinking about it all the time. I'm not obsessed with it. I'm simply in it, living my life through the lived body. So that's the first one. I'll share the second one and then we can talk about these a little bit. So the second one is the corporal body. This he defines as the anatomical object of physiology and medicine, which can be observed, grasped, and even manipulated. In other words, this is seeing our body, as an object. And he does some interesting, if you Google him, you'll find some articles online about all of this and shame and things like that. He basically says we experience shame when we experience the body as a corporal body. We experience fear, shame, other things like that. So for example, let's just take a big picture. How does hatred and shame develop in a racist, context, right? The people the slave traders who brought over Africans for slaves, they saw Africans as bodies, not as humans. So they objectified the body of those individuals and made them objects that we can now buy and sell, which allowed them to move away from them. I don't have to relate to them as a person. I can relate to it as an object, and then I can do all sorts of horrible things to that object because it's not a person. That same thing happens internally. When we see our bodies as an object, now I can hate it. Now I can distance myself from it. If that often happens through trauma or teasing or other experiences, we begin to say, that's my body, which I can now hate. A recent example of the difference from the lived body to the corporal body is I'm playing basketball recently, running down the court. I'm in the lived body experience. Now, granted, it's older and slower, but it's still, I'm not thinking about my body. I'm thinking about getting the pass and taking the shot. And then the basketball hits my finger. And suddenly I look down at my finger and my knuckle is like not straightening out. It's like pointed out and I'm like, oh, that's not right. And all of a sudden my finger is an object, which looks broken, right? So I go from the lived experience to the corporal experience. And that brings up all kinds of questions about, is my body good? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? I feel embarrassed about it. I feel afraid, all kinds of things. So that's the corporal body. So it results from fatigue, injury, illness, trauma, and it becomes the body I have. It can result from clumsiness and that my body is a difficult tool to be mastered. And it comes from situations of exposure when the body becomes an object for others, that gaze that women experience in our culture of the male gaze, right? That turns the body into a corporal body that I judge as opposed to what I inhabit and live through. So some of the questions that we can ask about helping our clients then, actually, I'm going to go back a slide. Some of the questions I can ask then is my worldview and is my body view and my faith background, my life experience, is it encouraging a lived body experience or a corporal body experience? When I'm engaging in my spiritual practice, is it encouraging a lived body experience where I'm just enjoying it, maybe like yoga or something like that, I'm just in it? Or is it encouraging self-hatred and body hatred because my body now becomes an object that stands in the way of who I want to be? Does that make sense? So I'll give you a quick example. I know we're running short on time, but Oprah Winfrey recently in a Weight Watchers video said, inside every overweight woman is a woman she wants to be. In other words, my body is an object standing in the way of who I want to be. So that's a corporal view of the body that gets in the way. So, so that's what we want to be asking our clients to think about. So, okay, what are some things we can do with clients to help them do this? One is, I think, take a spiritual history. Ask them about their experiences in the church. And a lot of us do that, but do it with an ear towards how did that spiritual community talk about the body? And have them explore that. What's the educational history around that? How did they walk away from their class on evolution and them thinking about that? Those are some questions, when appropriate, to be thinking about. How did you come to the conclusion that your body's bad? What are the historical influences on you and your personal history that does that? Let me mention the my body free association exercise. This is an interesting one, very simple to do. You can take just a blank sheet of paper, and I actually got this from Buck Runyon, who has been very active in IADEP and things like that. So it's part of a bigger thing that he does. But you take a sheet of paper, you write the word body on the top, and then you draw a line down the middle. On the left-hand side, you're just going to free associate. When you see the word body, what comes to mind? Free associate, at least a dozen words, probably not more than 20, but just have the client get down those words. And then the right-hand column, do feelings. So what feelings do you have when you see body? You know, so shame, hatred, fear, panic, all those things. Then talk about that. You'll learn a lot from that. Great fodder for therapy. Then have them do the same exercise, but at the top of the page, write my body. And when I've done this in groups, like just teaching like a workshop like this, everybody sort of freaks out when I have to now do free association around my body, right? But it's a great exercise to help you dive into some of those beliefs. And the last one, I'll just briefly explain. If somebody wants to email me and get like more instructions on how to do the fantasy exercise, but basically I ask a client to imagine or daydream or fantasize about a situation in which they inhabit their ideal body. So in other words, I ask them to describe, what is your ideal body image? And I've gotten all kinds of answers that are very interesting. Anything from a very skeletal kind of body image to kind of voluptuous. I've had people describe everything along the continuum of that. And then I say, okay, imagine that body. Now I want you to put that body in sort of a fantasy or daydream. What would be an ideal situation in which you are inhabiting that body? So I've heard everything from I'm alone in my room to I'm walking on the beach in a bikini, right? And I go, well, okay, let's take the one on the beach in a bikini. Let's talk about that some more. In that movie scene of fantasy, ideal situation, how are you feeling? Well, some people will say, I'm feeling confident. I'm feeling, sexy. I'm feeling, others are saying, I'm just enjoying the beach, right? Those answers have different implications, right? For me to learn about what the ideal body means to them. And then I'll ask something like, well, who's noticing you? Is anyone noticing you on the beach? Is it men? Is it women? What are they thinking? If the men notice you, what are they thinking? If the women notice you, what are they thinking? Is there attraction or admiration? What do you imagine them thinking about you as you inhabit that ideal body? So that's sort of the big high level picture of that exercise that you can do with clients to begin to understand their personal body view, right? And how that impacts then their body or their eating disorder behaviors going forward. So I know I've said a lot. I've talked a lot. I'm going to pause and let you ask questions or comment or.
Yeah, no, I think this is so incredibly helpful, especially outlining some of these intervention tools that people can use with their clients. Also, if you are someone who is struggling and you're watching this, or you are a loved one who is supporting someone, hopefully this has been really, really helpful for you as well. And you've gotten some tools to say, oh, okay, it's not just that oh, I have to help fix my loved one's behavior, or they need, or, you know, they are just simply thinking wrong about food or weight. No, there's this whole vast history that even obviously people without eating disorders have as a way of how they view their body. And just one thing to add, which I think is really interesting and increasingly relevant, especially that lived body versus corporal body, is that with the digital element, we view our bodies as something to be upgraded. Like an app, always to be, you get the latest software update. We're going to increasingly see technology become a part of our bodies. That's already happening. Plastic surgery is a part of that. How can I upgrade my nose, my, you know, my wrinkles, my chest? I mean, you know, all different kinds of things that people can do to upgrade their bodies, and they see it as simply something to be, or even to be made younger, more youthful. Genetic editing of children. You know, these are really questions that we as a society are going to have to decide, you know, how much of the body are we or are we not? And we have to make those decisions ethically too, because if we're going to help people with eating disorders, we can't just let them say, no, my body doesn't matter. It can be upgraded, or I can engage in whatever kind of disordered behaviors I want in order to make it what I want. That's very reinforced by digital culture. That no, we have to ethically look at, okay, what is the lived in body, and how do we help people to stay in their bodies and not just upgrade into the singularity, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I think we're on the verge of an incredible explosion of questions, right? So as you mentioned, how we interact our bodies with technology, what are we allowed to do and not do? You know, issues of transgender bodies, you know, there's all kinds of questions around that we're wrestling with as a culture. All of those things, I think, relate to these topics that we talked about today. And so, you know, do our clients have some sort of rooted thing to hold to, right, in the midst of all these changes? That they can say, this is my view of the body, and this is what's helpful about it, and how it can help me to move towards recovery. Yeah. You know, as they're rooted in something grounded, as our culture becomes more and more like, I wouldn't say ungrounded, but more and more different influences coming into the culture, which make it more confusing for us. And so I think these are really important questions to talk about. So we can, oh, I forgot I had another slide. Just quickly, we can help them articulate their body view. We can ask them if their body view aligns with their worldview. Often it doesn't. And then we can practice that lived body experience. We can give them assignments to go be relational rather than, you know, focusing on their body. There's lots of things that can be done around that. I think most of our clinicians already know how to sort of do that. They haven't necessarily used that phrase lived body, but I think they understand the concept of that. And so encouraging our clients to be in their bodies more and more is going to be really, really helpful. So, oh, and there's the last slide. So people are free to reach out at me. My role with McAllen Place is marketing, but I still do teaching and training, and I'm, you know, happy to help people with resources in any way, whether it's related to this topic or others. I love this kind of conversation, so happy to do that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Travis. This was great. I know I learned a lot. I hope all of you did as well. And we really appreciate your taking the time to cover this topic. And of course, I want to encourage all of our conference attendees to reach out to Travis if you want to know more, get some of those books that he recommended, or want to practice some of those interventions with your clients. So thank you, Travis, so much.
Thank you. Thanks for all that you guys do at Eating Disorder Hope.
Thank you.